Um, sorry. Those numbers help us apply for grants and get funding to continue to offer programming like this for free to our community. And so we greatly appreciate both your attendance, your support, your membership, and your enthusiasm for our programming. The mission of our organization is to preserve and share Cupertino's past, to strengthen our sense of community, and make Cupertino history relevant and available for all. I'm going to put a link to our website where you can easily sign up to get updates when we're going to have more free programming and events, exhibits, exhibit openings. Um, we have an amazing event that will be in September, early September. That's our annual barbecue. We have an exciting field trip coming up in June to Angel Island. It's a day trip that you can reserve seats to. We'll have an event in the late summer that is going to be at Deanza in the Visual and Performing Arts Center. That should be a lovely evening with food and speakers. So we have a lot going on. We're a plucky organization, and we'd love for you to become involved. Our museum, located in the community center, Quinlan Community Center, officially, we are thrilled to report, officially reopens to the public on April 13th. To that end, we are heavily and excitedly recruiting new docents, museum docents, who are trained volunteers who staff our museum. And I'll put a link to our volunteer application. You can also contact me. I'll put my email address in the chat window as well if you're interested in becoming a docent. The prerequisites are you like people, you're at least 16 years of age, and you have an interest in history. And I'll also mention membership in our organization. We have a great program that grants you free membership or free access to a host of museums all across North America and a ton of museums in the Bay Area. It's like you have membership in those museums. You can attend lectures at membership prices, and you can just show your Cupertino Historical Museum membership card at the DeYoung, for example, and get to go to any of their exhibits for free. It's called the North American Reciprocal Museum Program, and their website is narmassociation.org if you want to look up. So if you're traveling and you've got your historical museum membership, you can use it at museums anywhere. If you're joining us from outside of our area and want to support our small organization as a way to say thank you for tonight's amazing event, join our organization. The membership can still benefit you even if you're not a local Cupertino citizen. So that is it for my plug. I would love to roll out the red carpet and virtually welcome as best I can our featured speaker for this evening, who has so generously volunteered his time and his expertise to regale us with all he knows about the lost railroad tunnels and this ill-fated railroad in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We're so excited, and I think the excitement that this talk has generated in the community is evidenced by the fact that I have 4 pages of screens, 4 pages of faces, and we sold, in quotations, over 300 tickets to this free event tonight, which is an amazing, as a museum and society director, that's an amazing response. I've not ever had a response like that to any of our programming, and I'm just absolutely over the moon. So let me tell you a little bit about Brian before we welcome him. He is a trial attorney in Watsonville, California. He grew up in Santa Cruz County and practiced law there. He's practiced law there for the past 24 years. He attended law school at UC Berkeley and became interested in California railroad history in the early 2000s. Outside of work, he's a high school golf coach for the Monte Vista Christian High School men's and women's golf teams. He gives talks on World War II and U.S. Civil War history to high school groups. And he lives in Corralitos, California with his wife and 2 children. And he is an amazingly generous person for being here with us tonight, and we are so grateful to welcome him. And I hope you can unmute and applaud with me for just a little bit. He also said he'll stay around after his talk to answer as many questions as you have. So hopefully with this many attendees, we can manage question asking together. So join me in welcoming Brian Liddicoat tonight. Please mute yourself. We don't want to hear the dishwasher while he's talking.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And let me just ask if you can give me a quick thumbs up if everyone can hear me clearly. Okay, good. Let's get this started. So I haven't given this this railroad talk in a while, so I'm very grateful to have been invited back. I started giving these talks on the South Pacific Coast Railroad in about 2000.
What the hell?
There we go.
I'm so sorry, Brian. I was hearing noise from others.
Anyway, that's okay. Life happens. As you know, I'm a trial attorney, and we're doing lots of court appearances and even trials by Zoom. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But we all muddle through somehow. So as I was saying, I've been giving these talks since about 2009, and gave quite a few of them between 2009, 2015. And then things trailed off for a bit. So hopefully I haven't forgotten everything since I was at the high point. I'd like to briefly share my screen. I'm going to be kind of taking you through slides in movie form. But one thing I want you all to take note of, if you're interested in this subject and you're looking for a book to follow up on, there's quite a number of books that have been written about this railroad and other railroads in the area. But one book that I have no financial interest in, but a personal interest, is Derek Whaley's book, Santa Cruz Trains. It's the most recent book, and I really think the best researched. My only connection to this book by Derek Whaley is that as a very young man, I think he was a teenager, he attended one of my earliest train talks, and it got him interested in the subject. And he went on, I think he either has a PhD in history by now, or he's getting a PhD in history. But he took research on this railroad far deeper than I ever could have. So I'm grateful to have piqued his interest and given him the start to writing this book, and I'd very much encourage you all to read it. I bought it new, and hope you will as well, and reward Derek for the enormous efforts that he put in. Before we begin the presentation, let me also just say one thing about Jennifer Furlong, who introduced me. I've never actually said this before in a speech to a museum, but I really want all of you, if you enjoyed the speech tonight, to please donate a little something to the museum or help it in some other way. I've always been ably assisted by directors of museums or directors of organizations that have come and had me speak. But Jennifer has just been particularly kind and hardworking in setting this up and dealing with my scheduling issues and other scheduling issues. And I really think she deserves any support that you can give her and the museum. So please do follow up with Jennifer and the museum afterwards. So that said, let's get started with the program. And let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. Give me just 1 second. Okay. So at this point, Jennifer, give me a thumbs up if you're all looking at this picture of an old steam locomotive, and we'll talk about the South Pacific Coast Railroad, which generally operated between 1880 and 1940. And although its fate in the end was a bit sad, I will say that from about 1880 to 1915, it was by far and away the most profitable short line railroad in the United States. So if it came to a sad end, it reached really great heights before that occurred. Give me just 1 second to clean up something on my screen here. Apologize for a short break. Just have to get rid of a window that doesn't want to close. All right, now we can begin. So for me, as Jennifer said, I got interested in this subject in about the mid-2000s. I grew up in Santa Cruz County, and I think like most people, I had never heard of this railroad, or the idea. I think I'd heard rumors that there were tunnels somewhere in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but really didn't give it much thought. This subject is now easily accessible on the web. If you look for Santa Cruz Railroad tunnels or South Pacific Coast railroads, you're going to find numerous websites devoted to it. But when I first started investigating this for myself, there were books written on it if you knew where to look for them in the library, but otherwise there really just wasn't a lot of general knowledge. And so it became kind of a fun Indiana Jones style adventure for me to kind of explore and learn more about this, and about a lot of time spent, as Dr. Jones would say, a lot of time spent in the library, and then time spent out in the wilderness, dodging pit bulls and meth labs and all kinds of other fun things that you find out deep in the mountains to explore this railroad. This map that you see comes from Rick Hammond's book, one of the early and still one of the best books on the subject, and it really lays out the 25 miles of fantastic railroad engineering that we're going to be talking about tonight. And that's the old line that used to run from Los Gatos up here at the top, through what's now the Lexington Reservoir, and then through a series of tunnels, two of them over a mile long, and one of them going right under Highway 17. Every time you drive Highway 17, just a little bit north of the Laurel Curve, you're passing over one of the longest railway tunnels in the Western United States. And it's still there. It's been plugged up since about 1940, or 1942 rather, but still there. And a big chunk of it still operates today as the Santa Cruz Beach Train. And we'll talk about that a little bit. As always, at this point in the program, I'd like to thank my wife, Zenaida, who allows me to engage in this strange hobby of exploring abandoned railroads. And I'd like to say Zenaida puts up with this as a hobby for me for two reasons. One, it doesn't cost anything. And secondly, the chances of me running into single women out while exploring abandoned railroads is pretty much zero. Our story for me really starts at Roaring Camp, which is a place I'm sure that many of you have visited or taken your children to. I'm happy to say that even with the long stretch of the COVID shutdown that we've had, Roaring Camp still seems to be going very strong. And I went on Roaring Camp many, many times as a kid. I went through a time in the late 2000s where I had children of my own, and for a long stretch, I was taking my toddler son to Roaring Camp almost every weekend. He really, really enjoyed it. But as you know, there's two trains at Roaring Camp. There's the steam train, which was built in 1964, purely as a tourist train. It never operated as a logging railroad. But you'll note that when you ride it, often the conductor will say, the steam train at Roaring Camp was built to honor the legacy of all of the many logging railroads that operated here in the San Lorenzo Valley. And it never occurred to me at that time to ask, well, where were those other logging railroads that operated in the San Lorenzo Valley? We'll talk a little bit about that. But there's also another train, and that's the Beach Train, which I believe has just reopened for the 2022 season. And if you've never ridden the beach train between the boardwalk and Felton, Roaring Camp, would definitely encourage you to try it. It's a beautiful trip through the San Lorenzo Valley and goes along the vestiges of the same railroad that we'll be talking about tonight. But you know, if you stand where that beach train was that I just showed, and you look to the north, you're looking to the north at these tracks in the distance that kind of disappear. They cross Graham Hill Road and then they just disappear into the woods, and they seem to keep going off north. And so when I had come back to Santa Cruz and I was practicing law and eventually just looking for places to hike, I kind of asked, gosh, I wonder where did those tracks go? So I just put on my walking shoes and started walking. And if you walk past where I am now, the first place you come to is Mount Herman. There's a beautiful trestle that goes over the creek there, and then you see what looks like an old depot. I didn't know anything about an old railroad that used to operate in this area, so I really didn't know what to make of any of this. But certainly looked like this depot had been there for a while. The tracks just keep on pushing north, and I just kept walking along them, and eventually you come to what looks like the remains of an old quarry. Looks like it had been shut down for many years. Looks like there was a small rail yard there, so they must have been loading sand, something. Didn't know what it could have been. It just seemed like a big old abandoned mystery, and the tracks just kept on going on. So I just kept walking on, and eventually after about another mile north of that sand quarry, the tracks just end right here at a place called Olympia. And I remember coming up there for the first time and realizing, oh, well, I guess that's the end of it. And I asked some people that were nearby riding horses, do these tracks go anywhere else? And I said, no, that's the end of the tracks, nothing else. So I forgot about this whole thing for a long time. I figured I'd, kind of solve that mystery. And then a few years later, I was having dinner at a restaurant down in Santa Cruz and struck up a conversation with a couple of other guys who were there. And we talked about places to go hiking in the Boulder Creek, Ben Lomond area. And I mentioned that I had hiked those railroad tracks that go north out of Roaring Camp. One of the other guys in the conversation, he said, well, those tracks used to go all the way through the mountains to San Jose. I said, really? I never heard anything about that. He said, oh yeah. So they dug these tunnels under Highway 17 and the old Summit Road. I don't know where they are, but I guess if you really wanted to find them, you probably could go find those tunnels. Wow, that would be really interesting. The other guy in the conversation, he said, you know what else? Those tunnels, the Army, they like blew them all up during World War II. And then one of them was turned into like a secret Cold War bunker or something. Okay, man, get you another drink. But I thought to myself, boy, if even half that story is true, that sounds really interesting. I'd like to learn more about that. So again, in the age before the internet, really all I could do was go down to the library and look in books. And, we didn't have Google Maps like we do today. So I just kind of buy old maps of the San Lorenzo Valley area and try to piece together where this old railroad could have been, and now come to share the story with you. So we've kind of started at the end of the story, but let's go back to the beginning of the story. And I'd like to take you back to the year about 1869 and introduce you to one of the heroes of this tale, Mr. James Fair. And so in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad has just been finished, the Golden Spike and Donner Pass and the Big Four. And so James Fair at this time, he wasn't a member of that group, but what he had done is he had made a fortune in the Virginia City silver mines. He ended up being not only a foreman of some of the mine construction there, where he learned a lot about hard rock tunneling, but he also had ended up becoming a 25% stakeholder in the Virginia City enterprise. So he was, by our standards, not just a billionaire, but a gazillionaire. And so now the Virginia City venture is pretty much finished. And James Fair is looking around for his next big venture. And at this point, the big four, Hopkins, Stanford, Crocker, and Huntington, they're the four most powerful men in California. They just finished the Transcontinental Railroad. James Fair looked at them. He said, well, I learned a lot about building railroads with the Virginia City mine. I'm tougher than these four guys put together. I'm going to build my own Transcontinental Railroad and put them out of business. He actually had the idea of building a narrow gauge railroad that would go all the way from the Bay Area east to the Colorado silver mines and compete directly with the big four. He didn't get all the way there, but he did build something pretty amazing. And if you're going to, even for a man with James Fair's money, if you're going to take on the big four and build another transcontinental railroad, you're going to need a little walking around capital first. So his idea was that he would start up in Oakland, the top of where you see this map, and he'd build a railroad down the East Bay, which at that time was very sparsely settled. He'd get all the way to San Jose, and then he'd go south to Los Gatos, and then through the mountains to Felton and Santa Cruz. You have to appreciate that at this time, Santa Cruz was the third busiest port in the entire state of California. It was, in fact, Santa Cruz County at this time was the fourth highest GDP, the fourth highest wealth creation of all the counties in the state of California. And all of that wealth was coming out of the San Lorenzo Valley in the form of redwood timber. But they didn't really have a good way to get it all the way from the sawmills up in Boulder Creek all the way down to Santa Cruz, where it could be taken out by ship. Same with all of the limestone that they were mining up in Felton and Boulder Creek. So Wright's idea was to punch a railroad through the Santa Cruz Mountains, get all the way to Felton, and we'd take the railroad down to Santa Cruz as well. But Felton is the real goal, because at Felton, we can build a huge rail yard. We'll build another railroad all the way up to Boulder Creek, and that whole railroad enterprise will act as a giant money conveyor belt, taking redwood timber 24 hours a day on trains going up to the Bay Area. Excuse me. Now, as I said at the time, in the mid 1870s, in the San Lorenzo Valley, they were cutting down and milling enormous quantities of redwood, but they really didn't have a good way to get it down to Santa Cruz. One thing they did have was an 8-mile long flume, which was really an amazing piece of engineering, which is totally lost to us now, except in photographs. It was really an amazing structure. And you think about it, you're trying to design a flume where the water runs downhill at all times, so just barely enough downslope to keep the water running. And you can imagine the millions, billions, whatever illion you want to use, pieces of timber that you'd have to use to keep this thing operating. This ran all the way from Boulder Creek down to Felton. It's the progenitor of every log ride you've ever been on. This is the end of the flume at Felton. This is basically where downtown Felton is today. And you can see all these cut pieces of timber that have come down on the flume. And then to the right, you can see this tiny steam engine there. That's the old Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. The Santa Cruz and Felton was a really rinky-dink operation that had been built originally. It was originally built to follow the San Lorenzo Valley line that the beach train uses today. Train nuts like myself love to argue about minor details. So at this point, any good train nut would be standing up and arguing, well, it didn't follow exactly the right of way. There's 2 or 3 minor sections that are different now, and that would be absolutely correct, but close enough for normal people. But the Santa Cruz and Felton was always underfunded. It's amazing that even in these times where you have all this incredible timber wealth built up in Boulder Creek, that they couldn't get around until James Fair came to the picture. They couldn't get around to building a proper railroad to operate it. The Santa Cruz and Felton also came all the way down to Santa Cruz. And many of you have seen if you've driven in downtown Santa Cruz or you've ridden the beach train, you're aware that this tunnel at the bottom of the picture, there's a railroad tunnel that goes right under the Mission Hill in Santa Cruz. And I have to confess, I'd always wondered as a child when my mother was, driving me around Santa Cruz, I'd look out the window and I'd see that tunnel there, and I think, why'd they build it under the hill? Why didn't they just go around the hill like the road does? Well, there's a simple answer to that question, and the answer is this. The city fathers of Santa Cruz were paid off by a competing horse-drawn carriage railroad line. This original line, the Santa Cruz and Felton, went basically straight down the Pacific Garden Mall, or was going to. And so the city fathers of Santa Cruz passed a law saying any competing service that wanted to use those rails could do so free of charge. So the Santa Cruz and Felton people said, yeah, we've got a better idea. So to get around that, they dug the tunnel under the Mission Hill and ran the rail line down Chestnut where it goes today. And they gave a great big middle finger to the city fathers of Santa Cruz. And that's why there's a tunnel under Mission Hill, or so they say. Getting back to James Fair's enterprise, this is a photograph of the Oakland Wharf. And if you had gone back to the East Bay in the 1870s, one thing that you'd note that's different about the East Bay compared to today is that both at Alameda and Berkeley and Oakland, they had these long railroad piers that went far, far out into the bay, miles out into the bay. And when I saw this photograph, I was immediately taken back to sitting on a sailboat when I was in law school at Cal Berkeley, and seeing these old piers jutting out of the water way out in the middle of the bay, and thinking, who the heck would build a pier all the way out here? And this is what they were doing, so that ships that came in under the Golden Gate, or through the Golden Gate rather, didn't have to go all the way to tie up at Oakland or at Alameda. They could tie up out here in the middle of the bay, and the railroad would come out and meet them. Again, these things built by James Fair's South Pacific Coast and the Southern Pacific Railroad as well, and the Central Pacific, really revolutionized, I guess in some ways it was kind of what we would call roll on, roll off today, but 150 years ahead of its time. Excuse me. The South Pacific Coast Railroad wasn't limited purely to railroads. They also built a whole network of ferries that operated well into the 20th century. And many of these ferries were rail ferries. So trains could roll right onto the ferry. The ferry would then, go, say, from Oakland to Sausalito, unload the train. You could pick up a train in San Francisco and ride it all the way down to Santa Cruz, and you never had to get off the train. It would just be rolled onto a ferry, taken over to Alameda, join the South Pacific Coast Rail Line, and head south. And these ferries would have been a regular sight all over the bay. James Fair, in some ways, kind of reminds me a little bit of Steve Jobs in his attention to art and to detail. One thing that was very important to him was that all of the South Pacific Coast Railroads station interiors be very, very opulent. He wanted, even though it was a smaller railroad, say, than the Central Pacific or the Southern Pacific, he wanted to evoke images of wealth and grandeur. And so all of his stations and the interiors of the cars were very beautifully appointed. But so getting back to our story of pushing south to Santa Cruz. So we've talked about the beginning of the railroad, which for the South Pacific Coast really would have been up at the top in Alameda. And then pushing through all these cities, many of these cities in the East Bay actually began as railroad towns, especially Newark. Any good railroad entrepreneur, it's not enough to build the railroad. You want to build industries along the railroad so that your industry will grow and your railroad will have customers that you're going to make yourself. One thing that James Fair did is he founded the town of Newark. And Newark for him was going to be a bedroom community for wealthy people working in Oakland. You could live out in the country, outside the city. James Fair would sell you a big house or a plot of land you could build a mansion on. And then you would ride the train from Newark to your job in Oakland every day, or San Jose, whatever you wished. And from there, we'd push the railroad south to Los Gatos and Santa Cruz. This is a picture of what the Santa Clara Depot looked like right about the time the South Pacific Coast came through. And this depot still exists. It's the depot right by Santa Clara University. It looks a little bit different today, as you might guess. And I made one big mistake. I actually went to that depot and gave a talk to the National Railroad Historical Society. And I made the mistake of saying off the cuff that this must have been what the depot looked like in 1877 when the South Pacific Coast Railroad arrived there. And I was immediately set straight by the man in the back who had written multiple books purely devoted to the history of depots of the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. And just by the design of the roof, he was able to identify exactly the period of years when this photograph would have been taken. So railroad nuts, we take this subject extremely seriously. You've been warned. So finally, we push south from San Jose and we've arrived in Los Gatos. Now the fun begins, because up until now, construction of the South Pacific Coast Railroad has been quite simple. It's basically been straight lines through rural, almost uninhabited areas, as you saw from the last photo. Santa Clara, San Jose, very, very tiny settlements at this point. But now that we've arrived in Los Gatos, we're about to start the 25 miles that are the fun bit, as we would say. So I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor moving around. You can? Great. Awesome. Thank you very much, Jennifer. So let's pretend that we are all part of the engineering team for the South Pacific Coast Railroad, and we've come to Los Gatos, and our mission is pretty simple. We're going to start here where this 17 symbol is for Highway 17. That'll be coming along in the future in about 80 years. And there is no Lexington Reservoir yet. That's just gentle cow pasture. The dam will be built in the 1950s. And our job is to get the railroad from basically where the town of Lexington is right now, right about here, over to Felton. From Felton, Mr. Fair has already generously purchased for us the Santa Cruz and Felton Railroad. We'll simply improve that rickety railroad and extend its line into what's the beach train today. But how do we get from Los Gatos to Felton? Mr. Fair can afford to purchase basically any land that we want. So for us as railroad engineers, we already know the answer. When we're working in mountainous areas, to the extent possible, we're going to follow river valleys. Unless there's a major cataract or a waterfall, river valleys work great for building a railroad because they generally tend to have, relatively smooth slopes, plenty of room for rights of way. So what we can do here is we'll take the railroad up Los Gatos Canyon, and maybe right about here, we'll punch through the summit ridge and then come down, maybe punch through what'll be Highway 17 in the future. So that's a couple of tunnels. Where we'd really like to get to, and something that would jump out to a railroad engineer, is this creek right here. That is Ziante Creek. And it's really almost like it was made for us, because you see what Ziante Creek does. When it gets up here, it comes to the right, and Ziante Creek cuts through these mountain ranges right here, at least 2 mountain ranges. We're not going to have to build tunnels for that. All we got to do is get the railroad to here, to Ziante, then we just follow Ziante all the way down to Felton. Another job that another team will be working on is building a narrow gauge rail line from Felton all the way up to Boulder Creek. Boulder Creek is where all of our timber is going to be coming from. Boulder Creek is now one of the busiest sawmill towns in the United States, with multiple sawmills working all of these creeks. one of the questions I learned to ask in studying mountain railroads like this is you come to a town in the mountains, you ask, why is this town here? Why is there a town at Boulder Creek and not 5 miles up or 5 miles down? The answer to that, although this map doesn't show it as well as I should, is that Boulder Creek is where two major creeks feed into the San Lorenzo River, Boulder Creek to the left and Bear Creek to the right. They actually refer to this kind of triangle of creeks as the Turkey Foot. It's not the most romantic name, but it actually describes it pretty well. And so Boulder Creek exists as a town because it's sawmill heaven. You've got all these creeks, you've got access to timber. And then from there, the flume's been taking it all the way down to Felton. But we'll replace that flume with a narrow gauge railroad of our own. And then here at Felton is going to be our big headquarters. That's where we're going to build a huge rail yard near what will later be Roaring Camp in almost 100 years. And that rail yard will be full of working people and trains 24/7. Because the way that this railroad is going to become rich and wealthy is trains are going to be running all day, all night. And the lumber will never stop. We'll just be taking timber down all day, all night from Boulder Creek. And that's until about 1915. That's exactly what happened. So let's move on. So this is a nice picture of Los Gatos Creek right about the turn of the century. You can see the old Santa Cruz Highway that will later become Highway 17 on the right, and the railroad is over here on the left. And the dam, the James Lenahan Dam or the Lexington Dam, will be back here in the 1950s. You can actually visit the railroad right-of-way. It's now a beautiful county park in Los Gatos. Again, I remember occasionally just driving on Highway 17, you'd occasionally glance down and see people walking there. I always assumed it was off limits and was happy to discover when I got this railroad fixation that it's a wonderful place. If you've never walked or jogged or biked there, I strongly encourage you to check it out. It's very safe, always lots of people, mothers pushing babies on this very nice flat right-of-way that used to be a railroad line. And it goes all the way up to the dam. There was one major trestle that was built quite close to the dam. The dam in the future will be back here. This trestle crossing over Los Gatos Creek. And if you visit the place today, although it's obscured by lots of overgrowth, you'll see those two piers. They're still right there. That's the remains of that trestle that we just saw. And I wonder how many people have jogged and seen those big concrete piers and wondered what the heck are those things and what are they there for? Well, it's the old railroad line. And you can see the old wooden supports for it right there, last used in 1942. Or I should say last used by a train in 1940 and then taken up in 1942. And here's a picture just looking to the right. Those concrete piers we saw are down here, the dam up here in the end, and the old railroad right-of-way right here, long abandoned. This is the earliest picture I've ever found of the town of Lexington. All of this underwater now, at least in the winter. And beautiful area, was cattle country. And the old Santa Cruz Highway going right through it. A couple of years ago, actually, maybe I used to say a couple of years ago when I was giving this talk, maybe by now it's 10 years ago, but there was a period of time where they were doing some major renovations to the water system at the dam. And to accommodate that, they actually took the water level way down, much lower than it had been since the reservoir was first filled. And so when the water level dropped, all of these old foundations and bridges and other things were suddenly exposed again, like this old road bridge that you see these people walking on. It had been submerged ever since, I guess, 1953, and then had finally come to light again. can see a marker there from 1926. And I apologize, my screen is beach balling there for a second. Let me see if I can go back very briefly. We had an image of the old railroad passing by a number of houses, and these images are of the foundations of the town of Lexington. Highway 17 would be up here at the top as we're facing west, and the railroad would have been running right about at the water line. It's been submerged for so long that you really can't make out the old right-of-way at this point. Some pictures of those old foundations, and kind of a then and now photo. I remember I was really kind of really focused on this whole railroad project at the time this happened, and I remember driving to a court appearance and seeing that all of these foundations were coming out, and I thought, I bet you I'm the only person that knows what that is and is going to go down there and explore it. And of course, that was nonsense. There were hundreds of people down there, but it was very interesting. But going back to the railroad, this is the location at the very southern end of the Lexington Reservoir, where the old right-of-way again emerges out of the water and continues pushing south. A lot of the railroad right-of-way between the Lexington Reservoir and Wright Station, where the first major tunnel was built, is now owned by the San Jose Water Company. And it's a big chunk of the right-of-way is used to support water lines that go between Lake Elsman and which is a small reservoir much farther south, and the Lexington Reservoir. Excuse me. Just to show where we've been and where we're going, you see Highway 17 here. But that's a different base from the railroad line. And the railroad line comes through what's now the Lexington Reservoir, Lexington Township. I actually should update this. That marker for Lexington Township should be right about here. The Alma Township, closer to where the right-of-way exits the reservoir, and then from there the railroad continues up the Los Gatos Creek base up to Wright Station, where the Summit Tunnel will be built, the longest tunnel, 6,200 feet. But you notice one thing, and this will come back to feature in the story shortly, is this marker, the Moody Gulch oil field, which was somewhere over here. It may interest you to know, if you don't know, that not only is there oil in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but there was, for a period of time, a working oil field in the Santa Cruz Mountains. I used to have a photograph of it, but it seems to have jumped out of the slideshow for a second. It was not a terribly profitable oil field, but it operated for several decades, till about the 19-teens, I believe. And some friends of mine and I have tried very hard to find any remnants of it, but I think whatever is there has just been buried under all the dirt or was taken away. This is a photograph looking south up the Los Gatos Creek from the remains of Holy City, which is another very strange place that we could spend some time talking about, maybe for another lecture. Very odd place. Good photograph here of the work crews pushing the railroad line up Los Gatos Canyon. Construction derricks there. And so far, everything going very well. This is kind of we had a then photo of that work, and this is kind of a now photo of what the right-of-way looks like at the moment. You see more concrete bridge piers. This is deep in Los Gatos Canyon. And again, unfortunately, this part of the right-of-way is owned by the Santa Cruz Water Company, or excuse me, San Jose Water Company, and they take trespassing quite seriously here. I've met several people who've actually been issued fairly hefty citations for trespassing on this part of the right-of-way. So all the photographs that you see here were taken at about 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning, which is when I figured nobody would be out there hunting for trespassers. But if you venture south of Wright Station, that's definitely a concern. Once you get far up into Los Gatos Canyon, just south of Wrights, you come into an area where the railroad crossed back and forth several times from one side of the creek to another, just depending on where they found the best footing. And you'll find these old cement bridge supports. This one here that's just fallen down into the creek. The picture doesn't really do justice to the immensity of some of these things. It looks like an old moss-covered battleship turret when you're up close to it. Just lost to history there. Much of this portion of the right-of-way looks just like this. Everything green you see in this photograph is poison oak. So when I set myself the goal that I would walk on every piece of the right of way that could still be accessed, I visited this place once and I've never gone back. And can't encourage you to either. A big chunk of this area, though, is what we would call fill, and this is a huge this structure, which is basically just millions, well, not millions, but thousands and thousands of carloads worth of gravel that was poured here to make this looks like an old Mayan ruin, perfectly symmetrical battlement, a fill that goes on for feels like at least a quarter of a mile, maybe half a mile. And you can see there's a section where there's no fill here in the center. There would have been a wooden trestle here. Maybe they wanted to let a creek go through. So they would have built that there. But just you can imagine the enormous amounts of very careful engineering and backbreaking labor that went into constructing all of this. At this point in the construction, it's likely that most of the workers would have been Chinese men that had not necessarily had worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. Many of those probably would have gone home by then, but people that would have been brought in by the same organizations that recruited for the Central Pacific. And I've also given talks on the Central Pacific Railroad, and not to belabor the story of why Chinese workers were brought in to work on the Central Pacific. By Central Pacific, I mean the railroad that goes over Donner Pass, but to employers who had a lot of trouble getting laborers to do this work. Chinese workers that came, they had a number of very strange habits, and one of their strangest habits is that if you paid them for a day's work, they would give you a day's work. They were very prized as railroad workers. They listened carefully. If you showed them how to do something, they did it exactly the way they were supposed to. They worked extremely hard, and as long as you fed them and gave them what they wanted, very specific types of food, they liked to gamble, but other than that, they didn't have very many vices except for opium. Which was they did enjoy smoking, or many of them did at least, what today we would consider a very mild form of opium, which the railroad was happy to provide because they only used it on their days off, and then they would come back on Monday and work very long hours. And so by this time, the 1870s, that had worked, I should say, those Chinese workers had worked exceedingly well for the Central Pacific. Without them, the railroad wouldn't have been buildable. And so I think James Fair's people were very happy to have them. We get all the way up to Wright Station today, and we have the first of the big tunnels, and certainly the most infamous, and that's the Summit Tunnel, which goes under the old Summit Road. And as we'll see, both of the portals are still there. Like all the other tunnels, this one has been dynamited shut since 1942. Enormous construction job, especially once they got into the interior. So this entire railroad project was expected to take about 1.5 years to build the Mountain Division, and it was supposed to cost about $20,000 per mile. Actually, no, let me take that. Not 1.5 years. It was expected originally to take 9 months and cost $20,000 per mile. It took 3 years and cost $100,000 per mile. And it was this tunnel that really made that was the reason for the cost of it quintupling. The James Fair, as I said, had plenty of experience as an engineer digging deep mines in the Nevada desert, but the Summit Ridge presented him with problems unlike any that they had expected. It's a geologically very, very active area. The San Andreas Fault runs right through this area. And caused, in fact, the entire tunnel collapsed, or big sections of it collapsed during the 1906 earthquake. I'm sure sections inside the tunnel were badly damaged by the 87 earthquake as well. But very, very difficult conditions. And very quickly, once they started digging from the Wright Station side, the northern side, they quickly began running into pockets of natural gas, pockets of very explosive natural gas and oil. And for a time, I should say this is in the period before OSHA. So the way that they would deal with the natural gas problem is they would actually have a foreman walking ahead of the work crews with a flaming torch. And you hope that that would be sufficient to burn off the gas. And well, it worked all except for 2 times. And those 2 times were 2 dates in February of 1879 and November of 1879, when diggers broke into chambers that had enormous quantities of natural gas. And when that flame touched them, it caused an enormous explosion both times. The later one, the second one, even much worse than the first, killed scores of people, including many of the Chinese workers. The tunnel collapsed. The tunnel, even when it was reopened, basically the walls, the dirt walls would burn. They would be on fire for weeks. And at one point, they just decided, you know what, we're just going to seal this thing off and let it burn itself out. And they went back and checked after about 3 weeks of inactivity, it was still on fire. And eventually they just had to brick the entire tunnel, almost basically over a mile of brick, instead of finishing the whole thing in wood, as you see here. Some in wood, but mostly in brick because of those fire issues. Now, if this railroad had been built by the Southern Pacific or any other enterprise that depended on shareholders, I think at this point they would have just thrown in the towel and said, okay, this is way over budget. It wasn't a good idea in the first place. We're pulling the plug on this. But James Fair was not going to be denied, because as far as he was concerned, if he got the railroad to Felton, it didn't matter what it was going to cost. And I'm often reminded, I was reminded today of that great Daniel Day-Lewis film, There Will Be Blood, if you've seen that. And there's a scene where Daniel Day-Lewis is talking, it's like, don't you understand? There's an ocean of oil under our feet. No one can get to it but me. And I think James, I hope I got that quote right. But I often imagine James Fair, pointing at the mountains and saying, don't you understand? There's a fortune in greenness up there. There's a fortune in redwood timber, and my railroad's going to be the only way to get it out. And he was absolutely correct. And the incredible profitability of the railroad up until about 1915, when the timber industry basically faded because they ran out of redwood trees, proved him right. And I don't know if it was worth all of the blood and death, but it was certainly worth the financial cost. And even after the 1879 explosion, most of the Chinese workers had the good sense to quit. They just said, look, we're ready to work. We're that we do good work and we want to get paid, but you don't know what you're doing. And we've already lost about 30 of our crew. We're not going to put up with this anymore. And they quit and went and did other jobs. And James Fair basically raised the wages he was willing to pay until he found a bunch of Cornish miners. I'm descended from Cornish miners myself, not these Cornish miners. But I can appreciate that they were the ones hard-headed and stupid enough to take the job. And so Fair was able to finish the railroad, or excuse me, to finish the tunnel. They had to go at it from both sides, but eventually the Summit Tunnel was completed. So we come to Wright Station, which is a place I imagine a few of you have visited. Just give me a second to scroll something here. So this is a photograph of Wright Station after the railroad had been completed. And so you can see there's a road bridge over here on the left. That road bridge still exists, a number of houses here, and the tunnel in the background with this enormous concrete structure that basically acts to keep water runoff from running into the tunnel. And that same location, if we magically teleport ourselves to about where this horse is right now, and we look towards the tunnel, that is what you would see today. The tunnel is there in the background. And if you go to Wright Station today, it's you're very unlikely to see anybody there at all, unless it's somebody that's come to see the railroad tunnel. But it was quite a busy place back in the early days of the railroad. All up and down the Los Gatos Canyon, there were numerous farms, and so you see an image here of people bringing their produce to Wright Station. It would be put on board the trains, and people would be eating that produce in San Francisco just that evening. Another thing, a very nice photograph looking out of the tunnel towards Wright Station in the exact same location today. All of these places very easy to find. This tunnel is sometimes called the Indiana Jones Tunnel because it has this beautiful water runoff in the winter. Perfectly safe to go inside. If you walk into it, you'll come to the area where it was dynamited shut in 1942. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But it's one of the easiest of the tunnels to access, and very easy to find out online how to get there. You see a person riding a bicycle, rail bike out of the tunnel. Another photograph from today with the concrete structure there in the background. And this is what it looked like in 1940 when the railroad was coming to an end. The settlement at Wright Station was long gone by then. One thing, this is a photograph of one of the first picnic stops of the railroad at Sunset Station. I believe that was the name. This is very close to Wright Station, adjacent to it. And one thing that James Fair realized early on, again, this is the kind of person James Fair was. He spent all of his time, one, building the railroad, and second, how can I make more money from this thing? And one thing that he came up with was he built a whole series of picnic stops all over the Santa Cruz Mountains. And so if you were a working class person in San Francisco and you didn't know what to do with your family on a Sunday, James Fair had a great deal for you. You could just buy a ticket on his train. The train would roll south, go from San Francisco, across the bay, all the way down the East Bay into the mountains. And all along the way, they had these series of picnic stops. And some of them, there were ones for basically any budget. And it was a really good deal. It was all the food you can eat, all the beer you could drink. And these picnic stops still exist today, as many of the retreats and resorts that still exist along the railroad, like Mount Herman, for example. And this is one of the earliest ones near Wright Station. In fact, there's a funny story that, as you can imagine, putting people on a train and then filling them with beer and then taking them home occasionally would lead to a number of disturbances. And there's a letter that supposedly a conductor had written to James Fair saying, look, I was working on a train last week down to Wright's, and on the way home, we had a lot of young women who were very drunk, and one of them punched me and they broke a whole bunch of windows. And Crystal, and I want to know what you're going to do about this. And James Fair's response was, look, I'm really sorry you got hit, but we're making a fortune on these. I don't care if they break every window on the train. We're still turning a profit. So give them more beer. And the picnic stops were very, very successful. Another shot of that same picnic stop here. This is the only photograph I've ever seen of the other side of the tunnel. The Summit Tunnel. That location was actually one of the last ones that I got to. That's a photograph of it at about 1940. Very difficult location to find. Again, these days, there's websites that'll tell you exactly how to walk there. But for me, in the days before that kind of information was available, I must have spent many, many weekends just wandering all over this part of the Santa Cruz Mountains, trying to follow trails and knocking on people's doors and saying, look, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm looking for a trail that leads to an old railroad tunnel. Okay, never mind, bye. But eventually found it. And like most things, you find it once, easy enough to get back to. Now, this side of the tunnel is very, very interesting because it's open about maybe 200 feet in. And you can actually, you can walk well into the tunnel to the point where you'd better have a flashlight because it's going to get pitch dark in there. It's worth visiting just to see a picture of my son, who's now driving. He was a little younger in this picture. This is a picture shot from the interior looking out, and it's worth coming into this just to see the incredible workmanship. Picture of a fellow that used to own the tunnel area, Corky. You can imagine almost a mile of, you can imagine people on their backs putting these bricks in for almost a mile of underground tunnel. It's incredible work. And again, those bricks required because of the gas issues. You finally get to the point when you walk in from the tunnel, you go in several hundred feet, and you get to the point where the tunnel was collapsed. And I want to say one thing about this is probably really the only original research that I was able to contribute to the story of this railroad. There has long been a myth, which simply isn't true, that the reason these tunnels are all dynamited shut was that the US Army dynamited them right after Pearl Harbor out of fears, which were, there were such fears at the time, that the Japanese might land somewhere in the Bay Area, perhaps down at Watsonville. There are suitable landing beaches there, and then they might use the tunnels to try to do an end around the defenses at San Francisco. And come in from the south. And that is such a fun story that it's actually made its way into a number of mainstream histories of this railroad. And I got a lesson in how history is written when I once had an audience with Bruce McGregor, who's one of the greatest Western railroad historians of all time, somebody whose feet I'm not fit to kiss as a railroad historian. And I asked him, Mr. McGregor, you put that story in your book that the railroad tunnels were dynamited shut in 1942 by the Army because of the invasion scares, but it's not really true. And I was just curious, why did you put that in there? Is there a source for that maybe I missed? And Bruce McGregor looked at me and he said, I have to be honest with you. I never even checked that because my focus was on the construction of the railroads. I didn't really care about the end of the railroads. I put that in the book because it was a really good story. And maybe that was a mistake because now it can be cited since it's published in the book, but that's kind of how history gets written sometimes. But again, that's not a reason to think badly or not read the books of Bruce McGregor, who's a fantastic railroad historian. The real reason these tunnels were dynamited shut is that the railroad shut down. We'll talk about it a little later. This railroad shut down in March of 1940, well before World War II. And the main reason that it shut down was, one, the timber industry basically faded out in 1915, and then Highway 17 came. And so this railroad, which once had trains running all day, all night, 250,000 trains of timber went through this tunnel from 1880 to 1915. That's a really incredible number when you think about it. But by the 1930s, with the Depression, there was no way that they could afford the cost of rebuilding this tunnel every year. And so the Southern Pacific, which owned it at that time, decided to pull the plug on it. And they did that in 1940. And they spent a couple of years working with the California Railroad Commission to get formal permission to abandon it. And then in 1942, after all the tracks had been taken up and all of the trestles had been taken up, and basically you have a very thorough, there still today are railroad salvage companies that when a railroad is shut down, they will go through like very well organized locusts and take basically every piece of it to the point that, you wouldn't ever know that there was a railroad there. And then it's reused again, it's recycled, so to speak. But the last act was to seal the tunnels closed. The schedule for that had been set in 1940, years before Pearl Harbor. But I believe it was April 42 when the dynamiting finally happened. And that was just kind of the final act of railroad salvaging. What you would do in a situation like this, and we'll see inside one of the other tunnels later, is it's very common practice that when you abandon a mountain railroad, you may dynamite just at the ends of the tunnels so that people won't, wander in and you won't be liable if somebody gets hurt. But since you've only dynamited the ends, maybe a 10-foot, 12-foot section, it'd be fairly easy for an engineering crew to just excavate that fill and put in new supports, and then you can reopen it if you want to. I don't think that will ever happen to this railroad, but it certainly happened to many others. So that's why the tunnels are blocked. It's just normal railroad salvaging. It's not as, but again, as Bruce McGregor would say, the other story is a lot more interesting, isn't it? And in fact, this is some of the damage that you can see. This photograph, which has what is probably an incorrect date of February 29th, 1940. It was probably later in 1940. In the spring of 1940, when Southern Pacific really wanted to get rid of this enormous headache, this railroad that just cost a fortune, and they were sick of it. They prayed and they prayed for a terrible storm that would cause so much damage that they'd be justified in abandoning it. And in March of 1940, they finally got that storm. And it just caused enormous slides, what you see here, and they were able to get permission to abandon. This is, I believe, close to Wright Station. Let me also say that kind of damage, the damage that closed the railroad, was probably a routine occurrence in the 1880s and 1890s. There was nothing special about it. But in those days, the railroad was so valuable that you'd simply, hire 100 workers and have them go out there with shovels and clear it. Not a problem. But today, you can imagine the enormous expense just getting the permits to rebuild damage like that could take years. So we've dawdled enough here at the Summit Tunnel, which, as you can see, is very close to Burrell School Vineyards. Easy enough. If you get off Highway 17 at the Summit Road, you can easily figure out how to drive down to Wright Station. From the Summit Tunnel, the railroad comes up here to Laurel. And then we'll pass a second tunnel, the Glenwood Tunnel, which goes right under Highway 17. But every time, as I said, you drive north of Laurel Curve, you're driving over one of the longest railway tunnels in the US, and then to Glenwood and down to Zianta. One of the fun things for me about exploring this is, as I said, I'd lived my whole life in Santa Cruz. I'd driven over Highway 17 so many times, but my understanding of the Santa Cruz Mountains until I got into railroads was, well, there's Santa Cruz and there's Los Gatos, and Highway 17 goes between them. And that's pretty much all I know of the Santa Cruz Mountains. But as those of you who've ventured out there, it's a beautiful area. There's whole worlds in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And when you see signs, now what's different for me is that when I drive past this sign to Laurel Road on 17 northbound, I happen to know there's actually a Laurel at the end of Laurel Road. And you can, you can get off and drive right down to it. So this is Laurel today. The old railroad line comes right here, just to the right of this car. Are you still able to see my mouse cursor? Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. And goes back and then enters the Glenwood Tunnel, which still exists. Occasionally owners will put up a no trespassing sign, but I never had any problem just quickly walking back to take a look. I don't think anybody cares. Up until a few years ago, there was a very aggressive and very large and scary dog that lived. He's just doing his job, but he lived in this area here. And the fact that I am talking to you right now is absolute proof that if you walk to see the tunnel, you will not get eaten. That dog has barked at me so many times, but still here. But there's a picture of Laurel back then. You can see the tunnel back here. Picture of the train heading north for the Summit Tunnel. And let's remember this little baby. We'll see him again near the end of the presentation when he's a little bit older in another photograph. Another picture of Laurel Tunnel there. You see all, again, lots and lots of cut timber because there's still sawmills all over this area back at that time. Picture from just atop the tunnel. We're looking northbound, and this train has just arrived from Los Gatos and is preparing to enter the tunnel. That's the same location there. Train came up this route, and you turn right around, and there's the tunnel at Glenwood. Another nice picture. This tunnel is interesting in that it has a tendency apparently to flood and fill up with water. And so you see, if you visit it today, quite a few water lines running out of it. Excuse me, my slideshow has gotten away from me for a second. As soon as it stops beach balling, we will go back. What we're looking at right now is Glenwood, which is on the other side of the Glenwood Tunnel. Give me just a second. Okay, there we go. So we should now be looking at this map of the Summit Tunnel, the Glenwood Tunnel. We've had some fun looking around here at Laurel, and now we'll go across to Glenwood. And Glenwood's another area that you'll see signs from Highway 17. I'd never been down to Glenwood until I got interested in this. I didn't even know there was anything there at all. But it's a beautiful little community, very nice, again, horse country. You can't see, the Highway 17 is up here in the background. You can't really see any of these beautiful fields from the freeway, but it seems like a very nice area to live in. Lots of horse people. And that's what it looked like back when the railroad was operational. There apparently were quite a few, you see this magnetic springs. There were hot springs in Glenwood. I've never been able to figure out exactly where those hot springs were. I don't think they're working anymore. But that was another vacation spot. But again, at the time, not having any web pages to show me where this tunnel could be, I spent quite a lot of time looking for this tunnel. I thought it must be very easy to find. I mean, Glenwood, it's not a remote area, but I would drive back and forth on this road and say, it's got to be right about here. I mean, just look at the map. It's got to be right where Glenwood Road meets Eagle Road. I must have spent like an hour just walking back and forth on this road looking for it. I didn't realize all the time it was right underneath my feet. It's right down here. There's the tunnel, the other side of the Glenwood Tunnel. Again, lots and lots of poison oak. So not a place that you would want to go down to, but if you insist on marking all the tunnels off your checklist, that's the one we just visited. So from there, we head south and we're almost at Zayante Creek, that creek that's going to take us down to Felton. Nice picture of the railroad coming around the bend, so to speak, heading toward the final tunnel, the Mountain Charlie Tunnel. One of the final tunnels, I should say. This is basically the exact same location today as that picture that I just showed you. Like railroad rights of way, and there are quite a few of these in the Sierra, for example, old railroads that get abandoned, and because a railroad right of way is so well constructed, I mean, it's meant to take enormous amounts of weight, they almost always get turned into automobile roads, and that's the case with this road. There's a house down here at the end. In fact, unfortunately, in the last few years, this area has gotten fenced off by the new owners, and I can't blame them. Last thing they want is lots of railroad nuts knocking around their backyard looking for this. This is the Mountain Charlie Tunnel at Glenwood, one of the shorter tunnels, but it does have a secret, which we'll discover on the other side. This is, it's very difficult. It's a short tunnel. It's not long, but this is probably the hardest of all the various tunnel portals to get to on the Zayante side. You can't drive to it. You have to, again, in the modern day with the internet, easy enough to figure out how to get there, but in the days before, websites. It took me a really long time to find this one, but it was definitely worth it, as we'll see in a second. You can't just walk over the mountain to get to it. Now, this tunnel is kind of infamous because we talked about how they would dynamite these tunnels closed, but water at some point in the 50s or 60s got into the top of this tunnel. And water, as we all know, is an extremely powerful agent if you just give it enough time. And so over the many years, it slowly washed a hole in this fill. This isn't even the hole you see here. The hole is behind this in the dark, and it's very small, and you could squeeze through it and get into the interior, which was really neat. I remember coming here for the very first time. It was really an amazing feeling, like, you know, you were entering some Egyptian tomb. And of course, I went back and told all my railroad friends, you know, did you know that you can get inside the Mountain Charlie tunnel from the Zayante portal? I don't think anyone's ever been in there. Brian, gazillions of people have been in there. What are you talking about? Anyway, not gazillions, but it was still a really amazing find. It is absolutely pitch black in the interior here, and these photographs were taken by a friend of mine, Ross McClanahan, who I talked into bringing up several battery-operated Klieg lights and a very good camera for a long exposure. It's much bigger and more mysterious and empty than even this photograph. And you can see that there's quite a bit of collapse here. You can see that's the other portal in the background. It's not a long tunnel, but just with earthquake activity and geologic activity, parts of it have come down. I never felt that we were in any danger. In fact, it's pretty neat. You could see little tiny stalactites and stalagmites that have formed in just the few decades since the 1940s. However many inches a year those accumulate, they're accumulating there. And you can see the work that the railroad salvagers had done. There's basically a big sea of abandoned timber. That's what all these dark things are down here. That's the timber that the railroad salvagers from Christie's and Sons that took this railroad apart just decided, yeah, we're going to leave this. It's just not worth it. And then these little collapses. Now, this is what the tunnel would have looked like. This is a picture from the Mission Hill Tunnel down in Santa Cruz, and it's basically the same design. And so what you just saw, if we'd gone back there in the 30s, that's what it would have looked like. All of these wooden supports to keep the railroad operational. Now we're looking out from that Zayante tunnel. So you can see again where we've come. We saw the Summit Tunnel, we saw Laurel, Glenwood, this neat little Mountain Charlie Tunnel. We had to hike all the way up from Zayante to get there. And then the railroad comes down through Zayante, down to Felton. We've got the other narrow gauge going up to Boulder Creek. Oh, we're making excellent progress. This part of the railroad in Zayante it is really a beautiful area to hike in and follow the right of way. And it must have really been at one time one of the prettiest railroad journeys in the Western US. And James Fair advertised it that way. People came from across the country to ride on this railroad. This is a picture of President Roosevelt when he came to dedicate the Henry Cowell State Park. He rode the railroad. Many other dignitaries did. And James Fair knew that it was going to be, he really wanted it to be a special occasion. This is one of the first class cars, and they have these special swiveling seats because in part of the route, you're going to be looking out the left. And depending on which direction you're going in, once you get up to the summit and go down, you're going to be looking out the right. And they were already thinking about all that when the railroad was being put together. This is probably the only painting I've ever seen of the railroad. This is a tank siding at a location near Zayante that's helpfully named Tank Siding. There's actually a small town there with that name, not very romantic, but served its purpose. That's the location of tank siding, that picture that we just saw. The right of way in this area between that little Mountain Charlie tunnel that we explored and then going back to Zayante and Felton, this is now owned by the Santa Cruz Water Company. And again, technically lots of no trespassing signs, but I've never heard of anyone being cited in this area. I think one, kind of a basic rule of exploring anything that's abandoned, I guess there's a word for, I forget what it is, people that like to explore abandoned areas, is you explore until somebody yells at you to get the heck out of there, and then you apologize and you get the heck out. But I've never run into any trouble in the Santa Cruz Water Company. Walking along the right of way, which is here in this beautiful part of the railroad, you will see plenty of major slides. And you can again imagine occasionally people will talk about reopening the railroad. Wouldn't it be great as a commuter train? Well, only if you can afford to put up with these big landslides, which again, in the 1880s and 1890s, James Fair would have said, fine, we'll hire 200 people out of San Francisco and get this cleared, but you can't do that anymore. So I just don't think it would be cost effective, but very pretty area. Let's keep moving down. This is probably the last of the major tunnels. I apologize, I'm beach balling again. And this tunnel, it's called the Plug Tunnel or the Zayante Tunnel in the little town of Zayante, just north of Felton. And this tunnel is the origin of the occasional rumors that there is a secret government bunker somewhere in the Santa Cruz Mountains. This tunnel, after the railroad was closed, was very quickly turned into a storage facility. That is not uncommon with old railroad tunnels. They tend to be, at least the ones that are lined with concrete, they tend to be great for storing stuff. And so what you see here, this is the tunnel behind this little white house, and there's a storage facility there. It was originally created by a company called Western States Atomic Vaults that did a number of these, both in Colorado and in California. And there's always these rumors about, well, Disney stores all their original movies there, or government tax records are stored there. I think it's really just a storage area with lots of bankers' boxes of documents that are kind of stored there at random. It's run by Iron Mountain, which for accountants and attorneys is a very familiar name. It's kind of the largest document storage company in the world. So I think there's probably a lot of very boring legal documents and old tax returns and other stuff in there. If you're interested in what it looks like inside, there's actually a video somewhere on YouTube that I've seen that somebody posted of what the interior now looks like, with lots of bankers' boxes full of documents, but lots of fun. And so just south of that plug tunnel is where I first gave up this search. This is where the tracks end at Olympia. And so you might ask, well, why are those tracks still there? If the whole railroad was taken up in 1942, why did they leave this part? Why is there still a railroad through that the beach train can use? And the answer is that just north of Felton, up until the mid-1980s, there were two large sand quarries that you will notice if you're driving around Highway 9 or Felton. You will see these two giant sand quarries that I think they're shut down, but the excavations are still there. I remember when I was a kid in school, I had a friend who lived in Felton, and his father would take us looking for shark's teeth in those old abandoned sand quarries. And so that's what this part of the railroad was left, so that it could still service those sand quarries, and it continued to do so up until the early 1980s. There's a picture from the 70s of that sand quarry, same location. It was still in operation until then. Those sand trains were apparently a very regular sight for people in the Henry Cowell State Parks area. And then eventually we get down to Felton. The Felton Depot is now used by Roaring Camp. But first, before we talk about Felton, let's jump up to Boulder Creek. This is a picture from Boulder Creek at about right about the time of the earthquake. And you can see over here on the right, this is an enormous rail yard in Boulder Creek. Today, it's all housing. But originally, Boulder Creek was just this one street, and where all the residential houses are built now was once a gigantic rail yard You can see it here. Again, this whole area is houses now. All up and down this area, there were enormous sawmills, and you can see a train coming up to the sawmill here. There were small logging railroads that were built to service these sawmills and take their output down to Boulder Creek. And so when the people at Roaring Camp talk about the reason Roaring Camp was built was to honor the legacy of those San Lorenzo Valley logging railroads, this is what they're talking about. Enormous mills. And if you went to this location today, there would be nothing there at all. It's picked completely clean. Really some enormous railroad logging operations in this area. And I include this picture just to answer a question that I occasionally get is, how come we don't use logging railroads anymore? Railroads, I think, will be with us for a very long time. They're a great way of moving large, heavy loads across the country. But we don't use them for logging anymore because we have powered wheeled vehicles like this one that can negotiate much steeper slopes than a railroad could ever negotiate, with much less construction, much less trouble. We're probably doing more, with all the houses that we build and the houses that we live in, we're probably doing as much timber operations today as we ever have. But these wheeled vehicles are much more efficient and economical than logging trains. There are still around the world a few logging railroads, but very few, and fewer every year. And some pictures here at the end. These are some more of the picnic stops on the Boulder Creek Bench. This would be near Ben Lomond on a beautiful Sunday. And again, the one big difference, this would have been taken near the turn of the century. You look in the background here, you don't see redwood trees. This looks to me more like Morgan Hill or Gilroy. And that's because at about the turn of the century, the redwood trees had all been cut down. Almost all of the redwood trees that you see on Highway 9 today are second growth, not original. There is some original growth, but not a lot. There's the nice scene at Brookdale there. This photograph didn't come through quite well, but what you should see here is what is a very good photograph. It's just not displaying here properly, of a long train full of cut timber. And everything we've talked about today, all of the incredible work and the planning and the risk and the money and the deaths, all of it was for this. Long trains full of cut finished timber heading north from Felton to go up to the Bay Area. I like to think if James Fair was in the audience, he'd probably grumble at this point, okay, finally, you've shown me something interesting, something that's worthwhile looking at. That's what it was all for. And again, the most profitable short line railroad in the country until about 1915, just all based on that redwood timber. The line, again, this beautiful stone arch that was built at Inspiration Point. You can still see this if you ride the beach train today. Really amazing piece of engineering where they had to just push the railroad out a little bit, and there wasn't any dirt to build it on, so they built their own dirt with this beautiful arch. As we get closer to Santa Cruz, we're journeying south now along the San Lorenzo Valley, and our journey's almost over. But when you drive on Highway 9, you'll notice that there is a large Masonic community down near the end, and that is the old California Powder Works, which used to be a very important factory for making black powder, which was absolutely crucial to construction, mining, everything back there. It was actually built, I believe, originally for the Civil War, and then became a critical employer for Santa Cruz, the source of a number of really huge explosions. And most importantly, for our purposes, also had a small horse-drawn railroad line that took its products up from near where the river is, up to the railroad as it pushes south from Felton to Santa Cruz. Another picture of the California Powder Works there, and this is now the Masonic train. the railroad, as I said, had a wonderful and very successful, if short, career. It did have a very terrible beginning after all the delays. They finally had the opening on May 1880, and one of the first trains that went through actually derailed with quite a few dignitaries aboard. I think about 15 people were killed. And scores wounded, and this would have been on the part that's now the beach train, just as it starts coming in to Santa Cruz. Other than that accident, the railroad actually had quite a good safety record, considering the enormous difficulties of working in the mountains. As I said, I think that big sections of it would have washed out almost every winter. And they simply hired large teams to put it back into operation. One of the biggest events, of course, in Bay Area history was the 1906 earthquake. And the 1906 earthquake dramatically affected this railroad because, as I said, the San Andreas Fault cuts right through the Summit Tunnel. The Summit Tunnel collapsed, had to be completely rebuilt. And at the same time as that was happening, they took the railroad from narrow gauge to standard gauge. And I apologize, we're beach balling again, so we're suddenly jumping ahead. Just give me 1 second. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're back on track. And I include this picture just only to give you kind of an easy example of the difference between narrow gauge and standard gauge rail. And it's for normal people, as I would say, people that are not railroad nuts, it's not a terribly important difference, except that if you're gonna, what you would call broad gauge a railroad, meaning take it from the narrow gauge to standard gauge so you can run bigger trains, that's more than just putting in new tracks. You have to rebuild the entire railroad line because obviously everything has to be wider, and it's an enormous amount of expense. But the fact that they were doing this in 1906 just again reinforces the point that even with the closure because of the earthquake, the enormous wealth in that redwood timber was such a strong pool that it merited the enormous cost of expanding that railroad. The narrow gauge line that continued operating between Felton and Boulder Creek lasted until about 1938. And you see here, just after that railroad is closed, a bus is now operating from Boulder Creek, bringing people down to Felton. I'm sure many of the people taking this bus would have been riding the Boulder Creek Railroad just a few years before, but now they take the bus down to Felton to meet the train. But already the writing's on the wall for the entire line. Because it's just become far too expensive to operate this. And besides, even though it takes a little bit longer, we do have what we would call the old Suntan Special, which is the Southern Pacific train that used to go to the boardwalk coming through Salinas to Watsonville and then on to Santa Cruz. This picture, this page is important. You see one of the last trains on the top, you see one of the last trains going through Felton. And then down here in June of 1940, this is just after the permission has finally been given to abandon the railroad. And this is in Los Gatos Canyon. You can see those two piers, concrete piers, which are still there. But these workers are now taking up the tracks, then they'll take up the bridge, they'll demolish the rest of this, and the railroad will quickly disappear. And then the tunnels will be dynamited shut in early 1942. And that's those same concrete piers right there. The sad part of the story is not so much the end of the railroad, but many of those communities, such as Alma and Wright's, Call of the Wild, these are mountain communities that would have depended on the railroad. And once the railroad was gone, those little towns all dried up and blew away. I don't think the people that live there now would be very excited about having a railroad going through their backyard. But for the people of the 1940s, it was quite critical. Picture of Glenwood here. You can see how overgrown everything is. So it's March 9th. I think the caption says this picture up here is from March of 1941. So the railroad's been closed for about a year now, and very soon the salvagers will come through and take up all these tracks. Just also to give you an impression of how fast nature comes back, this is a fully grown redwood tree that is growing basically right in the middle of the right-of-way down in Los Gatos Canyon. So each of the three trees, this one, and this one, they cannot have been growing earlier than 1940, which gives you an idea of how fast redwoods get to full size. But very quickly, the line comes back. And I wanted to close, I thought this was a cute picture. This man here, Earl Laporte, he's pictured here. He lived his whole life in the town of Laurel. And he's pictured here in 1948. The rails have been gone, and he's posed here as if he's telling these young boys about the story of the town they're growing up in. And of course, we've seen him before because he's the baby in this photograph here. I didn't make that up. That's actually true. He lived his whole life in the town. I only wish I'd gotten a chance to meet him. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for having put yourselves through all of this. I hope that you'll, if you haven't visited any of the tunnels, you'll have a chance to do so in the future. And I will stick around as long as anyone's willing to ask questions. Give me just one chance to get a drink of water, and I will come back in just 1 minute.
Oh, absolutely. Please, please join me, unmute yourselves in thanking Brian with some applause for that amazing presentation. I think there are many people.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think there are many people who will join me in self-identifying as railroad nuts after.
Yay!
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna start going around saying, "Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm a train nut."
There you go. Absolutely.
Well, I'm sitting about a quarter of a mile from the Glenwood Tunnel.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I will be right back.
Thank you.
I will be right back in just 1 minute.
Yes, let's let him get some water so he seems poached. I know we had a question earlier. So when he does come back, Peter Tannen had a question earlier about routing the railroad. So we'll start with Peter, and then I'll ask Brian how he wants to handle questions from there. If you could keep yourselves muted so that we don't have the reverb and background noise, we greatly appreciate it. I'm also going to share, again, the links that I posted earlier to our website if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter so that you are the first to know about upcoming events. We have some really great programming coming up. I'll post volunteer applications. We're recruiting, and more information about our organization. So Brian, just to get the question started, in the chat window, Peter Tannen asked earlier, was there any consideration of routing the railroad from Lexington through a tunnel and then down Fair Creek to Felton? So this is when, about the time we were looking at the map, when you were contextualizing, how decisions are made when railroads are being built, and railroad engineers. And so Peter's question was about why didn't they take a different route when they were planning out mapping the railroad?
That's a good question. So what, Peter, what was the creek that you had mentioned? Or was it a creek?
It was Bear Creek.
Bear Creek?
Yep.
I don't think there was ever consideration to building a railroad up Bear Creek. There was almost certainly a I got to be careful when I say almost certainly. I believe that there is a map of the logging railroads that may show an old logging railroad that went part of Bear Creek. I just can't remember. I have to fumble around and find that map. But I don't think that was ever considered. There was a lot of consideration from Boulder Creek. As you know, the railroad actually continued. There were a number of extensions of that railroad that continued up kind of near, not exactly along Highway 9, but kind of nearby, right up until the part where it really climbs steeply to get to Highway 236. And there was a lot of consideration to punching a tunnel through that ridge to get to Pescadero Creek, and then taking Pescadero Creek basically all the way to the ocean up to San Francisco. But it just didn't happen. I'm ready for any other questions.
I've got one for you, if you will.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you knew anything about the Quicksilver mining branch that had broken off from Campbell.
Oh yes, I believe that there was a railroad that went, basically from San Jose up to the Quicksilver mines. I don't have any photographs of it. I think that Derek Whaley may have something in his book, and I know that at the Santa Clara Depot, I believe they do have some good pictures of that. So it wasn't directly connected to the South Pacific Coast Railroad, but there was definitely, and in fact, when I've driven up to the Quicksilver mines, I've tried to think, gosh, I wonder where that right of way was. But for sure, there was a line up there, and that is a really interesting area. I'd
grown up in Almaden Valley, and from the time I was about 15, I had gotten to know a lot about it. It went to the town of New Almaden and cut in at Campbell, but all the little stops along the way, Guadalupe and the Charles Charles Lefranc wine vineyard. I'd always found it very interesting. I just wanted to know if you had known anything about it.
No, I remember when I was researching this, that becoming aware that there was a rail line there and trying to figure out where it had gone. So that history isn't lost. It's
well, I'd love to compare notes with you at some point, and I'll maybe send you an email.
Absolutely, please do. And go ahead, Donna. What? Sorry, I'm not sure who's next in line. Jennifer, can you help, or should we just let people?
Just do it as you see people. It's difficult since there's so many pages of people.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to see. So if you can put a question in the chat window, we see Donna Wendell, we see your hand up, but if you can put a question in the chat window or just say question, I can call on you, or Brian can call on you.
Yeah, and so we've got lots of, I'm sorry, yeah. Do you have any info about the kids in the last photo that you shared in Laurel? Our family was in that area in the 40s. No, I don't. And by the way, I saw a comment earlier, basically to the extent of, you didn't live in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and if you had, you would have known all about this, and that's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. And the other thing I learned from when I was exploring this area as an outsider is a lot of the people that, like people that had moved from Silicon Valley to the Santa Cruz Mountains, they often didn't know anything about it, but their kids knew where it was. So basically all the good tips I got for finding things were from mountain bikers and kids that, were growing up in the mountains and had just been walking around. Let's see who else. And I promise I will stick around. Forgive us if we take time getting to you, but we're just not used to having this many people on Zoom. Donna Wendell, do you have a question we can answer? No? Anybody else? If anybody
Donna put her question in the chat window.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Which tunnel? No, it's okay. Which tunnel is closest to Felton or Santa Cruz and possible to enter?
The easiest tunnels, as far as tunnels that are easy to get to, the easiest would just be to drive to Laurel. Off of the highway. Wright Station would actually be actually Laurel is not the most interesting one. Wright Station, which I promise you, WRIGHT. If you look up Wright Station, you will. It's right off the summit from Highway 17, and just following Google Maps, you can get there quite easily. And it's definitely worth going to check out. So that's the advice I'd give people if you want to see something.
Email address for you?
Sure. My email address, I'll say it a couple of times. In fact, let me see if there's a way to just write it on the screen. I'm sorry. I'm just gonna say it twice. So my email address is, and I'll type it as well. It's Brian. Darn it! Can't for some reason. There we go. It's Brian, BRIAN, at Lidlaw. This is my work email, and I've just written it in the chat. BRIAN at L like Lima, LID like dog, LAW.com. Brian at Lidlaw.com.
Thank you.
Sure. And as I said, it's been a while since I've given this talk. There's been plenty of research in the intervening years, and I'll bet that if Derek Whaley was here, he could point out at least 5 or 6 major errors that I've made. That's the nature of the beast. I'll tell you another funny story while people are hanging on. When I was first getting into this, and I really wanted to find those tunnels, and again, just no websites back then. So I got a hold of, oh, come on, what's the guy's name? A really great local historian at Cabrillo College. Somebody else is going to remember his name and shout it out for me. He's written many books on local history, and he's kind of a funny character.
Sandy Lyon.
Sandy Lydon.
Yeah.
Is Sandy here? Sorry, I got to tell a funny story about Sandy. I called Sandy. I said, Sandy, do you know, I'm really interested in this railroad that used to go through the mountains. Yeah, I know a lot about it. I said, do you know about these tunnels? He says, yes, I know all about the tunnels. I said, do you know where they're located? He said, yes, I know where all of them are located. And I said, well, can you show me how to get there? No, I'm not going to show you anything. I said, well, why? He said, look, there's 2 reasons. The first reason is, if I show you how to get to the tunnels, you're going to tell all your friends are going to start going there. And the people that live up there who don't really like lots of people roaming around their backyards, they're going to put up fences, and then none of us will be able to visit them. I said, but the second reason is, if you really want to find these tunnels, you will find them. It'll take a little more work, and it'll mean a lot more if you find them yourself instead of me just showing you. And he was absolutely correct. So that's kind of my funny Sandy Lydon story for the day. But he's an awesome local resource. He's a genuine treasure for Santa Cruz County.
So John has a question next.
Sure. Let me also add one quick question from Christine Kurjan. No, unfortunately, I'm not related to the Liddicoats that used to own the Liddicoat store in Palo Alto, as far as I know. We've never found any connection. John, how can I help?
John, you're muted. Let me see if I can get you to unmute.
I was just letting you know about accessibility from tunnels in Santa Cruz.
Oh, please.
It's on the chat list.
Okay. Question, how many times did I get poison oak? Amazingly, I never got poison oak. I can't believe I didn't get it that one time where everything was just, everything in that green picture was poison oak. I put on a lot of ski equipment, which my wife made me throw in a garbage bag as soon as I got home. That was a crazy day. Any other questions or comments? I'm sure there's tons of information that I could learn from all of you. The only way I ever got to do this program was by learning from other people. I didn't know any of this until, as I said, about 2008. I'll say one last thing if people are hanging around.
John's
Oh,
back. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Please go ahead, John.
No, nothing from me.
One thing that I learned, it's all right.
Shouldn't
One
be.
thing I learned about this is if you are interested, there's one rule, which is a very important one for exploring old railroads, which is if you think there's something interesting, go see it now. Because if you wait a couple of years, it will be gone by the time you get there. There are a couple of really amazing and really beautiful railroads that we, just kind of been abandoned or lost just since the 1990s. The Northwest Pacific, which used to operate from Santa Rosa all the way up to Eureka, that's gone. And there's a number of really beautiful mountain railroads in the Portland area, which are also gone. And in areas like this, especially on the coast or in the mountains, once a right-of-way is abandoned, it's going to fall apart real quick and it's going to get completely overgrown and you won't be able to explore or enjoy it very much. So if there's something interesting that you want to see, go and check it out. Once I had explored this railroad, I got the really crazy idea that I would explore the entire Donner Pass line, which I would strongly advise you not to try. It's because trains there go very fast, and they don't. It's not a place for safety-wise for walking on tracks. However, if you've ever gone up to Donner Pass, the old snow sheds are still open, and if you know what I'm talking about, if you don't, just Google Donner Pass snow sheds, and you'll see these really amazing constructions hanging off the side of the mountain at Donner Pass, and the railroad doesn't use those anymore, and they're lots of fun to explore and walk through. All kinds of great stuff. Is there anything else I can help or answer for anyone? No? Well, then I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful evening. And thank you so much for spending part of it with me. And thanks again to Jennifer for her very hard work in setting this up. I think it was very successful.
Oh, Brian, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And we hope to see you at future events. Like and subscribe our page on all social media. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, and let me say one last thing.
Yes,
very important. If you do have any interest in this, and if you even have other questions, there's a Santa Cruz Trains Facebook group run by the great Derek Whaley. Yes. And there's also a wonderful webpage, SantaCruzTrains.com. Just Google Santa Cruz Trains, you'll find it. And that is basically the repository of all of Derek Whaley's knowledge on this. Lots of new additions, very grand. I mean, they have a map that shows you where all these locations are. Also very detailed, granular information on each of the stops, each of the locations. And the other thing I just leave you with, the way history gets written, there's still a lot of, there's disagreements on things like dates. Train nuts on Santa Cruz Trains still have titanic arguments over what was the date the last train actually ran between Santa Cruz and San Jose. And it's a matter of dispute because inevitably records differ. And I mean, obviously there's one answer, but we have like about 3 documents that give 3 different dates, not, because anybody's trying to fool anybody, but just because people write down the wrong dates. And even you can go back through the original records stored at the big California Railroad Center at the museum in Sacramento, and their dates are all different. So who knows? It's there's still mysteries that may never be solved.
So Brian, before you go, my name is Phil Edholm. I'm a model railroader and part of the
That's it.
California
Think
Central
about it.
Coast.
Think
It's
about
not
what
gonna just
you're
be hotels.
What do you think is going to happen with it, babe?
Oh,
No,
sorry,
it's not, baby.
sorry.
It's not gonna be
Let's
commuter
mute.
stuff.
Let's hold
What
on a
would
minute.
you-
I'll listen to all of you, but I want to hear let's first go with the gentleman that was talking about model railroading. Continue, sir.
Yeah, so yeah, I thought this, you might find this interesting. So this is a I'm going to share this. This is a 2x4 module, and it's actually, so I should be sharing. Let's see if
Oh,
I'm
that's
assuming.
awesome. Oh, that's great.
And so this is actually, it's 2 feet by 4 feet, and it's actually a model of the Mission Hill Tunnel, where the whole tunnel is about 22 inches long.
That
So
is
this is
awesome.
actually what would have been the south portal, and this is the what was the whistle stop there at the south portal. And of course, you really shouldn't be able to see the church from there, but this is then the north portal,
Oh,
and
this is beautiful.
where you can see the church, and there's a little house here, and kind of see the way it was put together. So
Wow.
anyway,
gorgeous.
so we will we actually do every year an event at the rowing camp. Typically in April timeframe, they'll do they call it a model railroad weekend.
Yes.
And so if you happen to see that next time, that module will be there along with another module that's actually the Wilder Ranch, that kind of the creamery there, not the barn, but more the siding for the railroad. So kind of an advertisement for those of you who are interested in model railroads. That's a great place to go see a narrow gauge model railroad and ride the trains the same day.
That's awesome.
Delightful. Yeah.
And a very nice lady, I think, had a comment as well. She was asking, what do you think about, or what do you think will happen with? No, that's all right.
Oh.
Ladies
Hello.
and gentlemen, I hope you all have a wonderful Saturday evening, and I'll be happy to, if you think of anything, please feel free to email me.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks
Yeah,
so much.
but again, remember what I said. If you had a good time this evening,
Yes.
please go online and donate something, anything, to the museum. It's not my efforts you need to reward; it's Jennifer's efforts. She's the one that made this all happen and is continuing to make it happen, and we want to support her.
Do you have a talk on Holy City?
No, I
Oh,
don't.
I thought you did.
Wish I did. I believe there's at least one book written about Holy City.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because I know it's quite interesting. You said it was another story, so I
Yeah,
thought
so yeah,
maybe
that would make its own lecture, but no, I didn't.
Yeah.
Don't have one on that.
Oh,
Thank
certainly.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to close the evening out for us. And again, thank you so much to everyone who came tonight. Thank you so much to my board. And most of all, thank you so much to our amazing teacher and speaker this evening. I feel like I've learned so much. And I've got a complete picture, which I really enjoyed. That's what was so great about tonight, is getting the whole context. You really painted a picture for us, and set the scene. And I know the key players and the before, the during, the after, and I have a really complete, I feel like a complete picture, Brian. And that's what I really.
Thank you. That was the goal.
It was so riveting. Yes. And again, I now identify as a railroad/train nut. Thank you so much.
It's all about human stories.
Yes, it's all fascinating. This is why we love history.
Yep.
So again, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone in attendance. And I'm going to close this out.
Bye-bye, everybody.
See you again.
Night-night.